I want to pass my word to Oля Boyka. She is a coordinator from CAN Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia. And she will say a few words about the climate dialogues, about these webinars, and about the bigger team that supports this process. Olga, please. And she will speak in Russian. So if you want to hear her and understand her, please choose English channel.
Спасибо большое. Всем доброе утро, добрый день. Меня зовут Ольга Бойко, и я извиняюсь очень сильно, но, Гульсара, я вас слышу в русском канале.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. Yes, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for your connection. I coordinate CNN in EECCA region. And now I'm here. I'm not alone. My colleagues are with me from Ebert Foundation, Andrei Makarevich, and they are with us, and Severin from Germany, from Bonds. You can see Severin here in our team. And actually, it is a team since 2020 organizes the project, which is changed every year, the policy dialogues, and our main goal that experts on themes related to climate policy can find each other, can find the common topics for discussions and the common products. It is interesting for them to work and to have a mutual exchange and international exchange, because we are regional network and we would like to work together to create a dialogue between people. That the progress, ambitious progress of the policy, climate policy will be good, because we can learn from each other. And the project had some changes and we made it more complex. We added a task force. Last year we had 6 task forces and people work on renewable sources of energy, on climate policy as a specific separate, also sustainable cities, for example, transport and future cities, cities of future, adaptation, biodiversity, and education. And we had plans this year to continue to develop, elaborate these themes, to invite people in the task force. Then 24th of February came and the war started, and we had some interruption. And now you observe our return, and we are glad that we are at the beginning again with you. For us, very important to hear from you what continuation you would like to see, where your role, who understand, who have expertise, what participation will be very important. And our 3 first webinars, the first was launched, it is a beginning. We will listen to the feedback from you. We would like to hear, to take into consideration, and based on this feedback to plan next year. Please stay with us. Thank you very much that you registered. We will stay with you through our channels on communication. And now I will give floor to Helen that we start. And I would like to underline that it's very important for us to know how your experience in this topic and climate energy policy, what has been changed, and your expectations from other exchange with other experts, what you need, what you really miss. Thank you very much.
Opening words. So also we'll have a few explanations, a few words about the next webinars in the end of our meeting today. So yeah, and you can also write on web with your suggestions. And a few words briefly about the agenda today, we will have our opening part is ending almost now. We will have two inputs from our speakers from REN 21 and Central Center for the Study of Global Regions, with a room for Q&A and discussion as well. So let's start today's part. I want to invite for the speech Vibhushri Hamrivasa, Community and Project Manager at the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st Century, more known as REN 21. And she will talk today about the consequences of Russian aggression in Ukraine for energy and climate policy in the region. Yeah, Vibhushri, can you hear us?
Yes,
Are you here?
absolutely.
Good.
Yes. Thank you so much, Helen, Olha, and everybody else for being here and also for the kind introduction. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen since I do have a presentation. And while we've done this several times before, I would love for someone to give me a quick confirmation when you can see my screen. Is it, can everybody see what?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. I'm Vibhushri from REN 21 and working on community and regional activities here at the REN 21 Secretariat in Paris. More recently, we've launched the UNECE REN 21 Renewable Energy Status Report. It's called UNECE, but it also, it encompasses 17 countries plus Kosovo across, Southeast and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Russia, and yes, it's a third of its kind, and this is what I will be sharing some findings from today. So very quickly about REN 21. It's the only global community of renewable energy actors from multiple stakeholder groups. So this includes science, academia, governments, industry, and NGO. We have over 3,500 community members. So apart from this network of organizations, we have individuals who contribute to our work. So for the UNECE report, for example, we had over 270 people contributing to the data, peer review, etc. And that's how we build our work, which is on a decentralized intelligence. And then what we focus on is knowledge products, dialogue debates, as well as community building. So on the knowledge side, our annual publications or even our regional publications are quite comprehensive crowdsourced reports entirely on renewables. So what is this report? Very quickly, as I mentioned, that this is, again, it's the third of its kind with UNECE and other partners in the region. And what this report focuses on is 17 countries plus Kosovo, so renewable energy, the status of renewables in these 17 countries in Kosovo, and has different data segregated into different chapters. So this launched actually in mid-September, so less than 3 weeks ago. And it does have quite a bit of information, not only on the status of renewables in this region for the last, say, 2-3 years, but also more recent information on the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This was very a slide I wanted to go through very quickly to say that on this, we are working with UNECE, the German Energy Agency, and the German Federal Ministry. So if we go into why this region matters, and I think this was particularly important for someone like me who is not from the region, but has come in close contact with it over the last few years working on this project. And I think many of you will recognize these, but what we really see is that there's a massive untapped potential. It is home to probably about 4% of the global population. And there's a lot of untapped potential in terms of renewable energy in the entire region amongst all countries. There's a high fossil fuels and import dependency. there's really a need for stable and secure energy supply. So energy security, especially accentuated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And there is a lot of energy poverty in the region, many countries which have unconnected or disconnected populations from the central grids, even though there's quite a high energy access. And there's a huge problem with emissions and air pollutions, especially from electricity and heat. The region has some of the world's highest emitters and of greenhouse gases, and this is also owing to its characteristic of having 5 net energy exporters with high reserves of natural gas and oil in the region itself. So of the, say 18 countries we assessed, 5 are net energy exporters, and some of these are actually global exporters. There is we see this with real competition with other energy sources. So what I mean by other energy sources is, fossil fuel, nuclear, but really outside of the renewable energy sort of space. And there's a high import dependency. So if you see this figure and all the countries to the left of the blue line, you'll see that those are all dependent on imports. So they're not self-sufficient and depend on imports of normally fossil fuel sources and rely on a very limited number of exporters. So primarily Russia in this situation, but this means that there's a lot of risk of not just rising energy prices, but also a huge risk in terms of managing demand in the future and also managing energy security. There's also many of these countries are very energy intense. So if you see on the right of this figure, you'll see that the focus countries' energy intensity exceeded the EU and OECD averages, except for Albania. But in all countries, the energy intensity was quite high. Although this has been declining over the last 30 years, and this decline was related to the economic restructuring after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this still remains pretty high, which means that there is the need or potential for energy saving and efficiency. And maybe one more reason why this region is important, because we see several drags and drivers, as we like to call them. And in this situation, it's really what is driving the growth and what is dragging it down. So you'll see the gray boxes where we spoke about fossil fuel dependency. So 13 countries are highly dependent on energy imports, and with Armenia, Belarus, Georgia, and Moldova importing more than 70% of their total primary energy supply. There are subsidies, large subsidies for fossil fuels, and artificially low tariffs for fossil and nuclear-based energy, which hinders development of renewables across all sectors. Although the size of energy subsidies as a share of GDP has declined, it was still significant. And we talked about the competition with conventional energy sources. So I think there is also the need to look at how are several of these countries decarbonizing their power sector, and with what that entails in terms of an economic model. So that would refer to time, build cost, security, for example, with nuclear, and also, of course, to be able to build decentralized power systems to address energy poverty. And we can't talk about these countries, we can't talk about actually any countries around the world without talking about investment, especially in renewable energy. And there exists a lot of risks and uncertainties, especially in relation to the regulatory framework, bureaucratic barriers, etc. And then there is public opposition. We've done a hard talk it's called a hard talk format with the Ministry of Energy and Sustainable Development in Georgia. And that's also where we learned a lot about the public opposition, mostly against hydropower in the Western Balkans. But having said all of this, there are lots of drivers of growth as well. And energy security and sovereignty, especially in the current context, is certainly one of them. There's also the EU cross-border adjustment mechanism, and there's which is quite a driver, especially in several of the countries which are energy community countries. There's health and air quality, as we talked about, the fact that the region is home to some of the most severe emitters of greenhouse gases, and many countries, especially in the Western Balkans, have pretty poor quality of air or air quality. Then this is another driver which is supporting the development of renewables. So there are some good news in the region, and one of this is that in the last 5 years, so that's from the last time that we did a report with the UNECE region, so that's in 2017, the region has added nearly 21 gigawatts of capacity in renewable power, raising the total installed capacity to over 100 gigawatt. So almost, let's say 20% of the total installed capacity was from the last 5 years itself. And I think it's really important to say that this is, these were not spread equally, but across all the countries. And here you can see that there are some countries which added more capacity than others. However, it is still quite encouraging to see how much progress was made in the last 5 years. Another really piece of good news was how quickly solar and wind capacity grew. And if you see this chart, you'll see that hydro, which has been historically the main contributor of renewable power capacity, remained nearly stable in the past 5 years, whereas solar and wind, the yellow and the blue bars, grew nearly 10 and 7-fold respectively. And this was the first time in 2018 that solar PV capacity overtook hydropower. This is some really good news, because this also means that there is a there's a diversification of energy sources, and it means that there is a possibility for regions to continue to build on this great momentum. And this growth has been backed by many factors. So apart from energy security, sovereignty, we also noticed that there have been some favorable policies with some countries having already switched. I mean, there's a high incidence of feed-in tariffs, and auctions are slowly gaining traction as well in the countries. But then there was also falling costs of solar PV and wind. And some of the leaders in the region were the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. And in these, we really see that there is an attention to policies which probably wasn't there before 5 years before this. There are some not so good news as well, because of course we looked at the status, which is the good and the bad, or rather where there is room for improvement. And here we'll see that the share of renewables in total final energy consumption remained nearly unchanged. So this, the share of total final energy consumption in this situation, or the share of renewables, excludes traditional biomass, but the average of the region was about 18% in 2019 and 2014. So in 5 years, there was very little change. There were positive developments in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Ukraine, Armenia. And the visible decline is probably due to a slowdown in hydropower, as we saw the minimal change in energy consumption as such, probably due to also some savings in energy efficiency. All this while, the good news has been focused on the power sector, so the electricity sector, where there's a lot of attention. But that's not the only place where we consume energy. And to be honest, I think the power sector is less than 20% of where energy is consumed. So the rest of energy demand comes from heating, cooling, and transport. So that's nearly 80%. And if you see these two graphs over here, you'll see that first, data was unavailable for all countries. So we're seeing a smaller subset of countries here. On the heating and cooling bit, the numbers seem quite large, but this is also because it includes traditional biomass, which is not always renewable in the traditional sense. And then the estimated share of renewable or modern sources is very minimal. So heating is a major challenge, especially with the climatic conditions, and it reflects very much on energy poverty, but the progress of renewables in this sector has been quite minimal. In the transport sector, you'll see that there's nearly no renewable energy share in the countries. And wherever it is, it's mainly driven by electricity. Biofuels are pretty negligible. There's also fluctuating investment levels. And maybe this is also a good moment to point out that for us, finding investment data for the region was a huge challenge. So we couldn't get any one source or multiple sources which compared data or consolidated data in a comprehensive way for the 18 countries. So the figures you see here includes public and private international domestic flows, but public international flows are probably the most comprehensive of all of this. So there's definitely an area of improvement when it comes to collecting data on investment. Regardless of that, you'll see that there's been a lot of fluctuation in the investment levels, and it actually decreased in 2015, 16, and 17. It went back to nearly 2013 levels in 2018, but you'll see that this is about 7.2 billion. When we look at investment in Western Europe, that is about 56.5 billion in the same year. So there's a huge challenge in attracting investment here.
Dear Vibhushri, sorry, we have a tech moment. Our Russian interpreter, we didn't have any interpretation in Russian channel. If you can wait for 1 minute or a few seconds while we can fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah, while we're also waiting for the fixing, I wanted to just share that we had one quick comment for Ukraine's renewables from Tatiana Revutska. She said unfortunately we will have to account the news stations either destroyed or occupied by, and especially in these occupied or the territories of the front lines.
Absolutely. No, and in fact, that's a good comment already, because you will see that we have some data on that as well upcoming. And please, this is being a crowdsourced report. Please do feel free to share any updates that have been made or any things that we might have missed in the report, and we'd be happy to visit and see how we could integrate that.
Good. Okay, maybe you have, there's still no interpretation, or so maybe someone has questions or comments, and I can support, or maybe all of you can support us with translation as well in Russian. So if you have any questions or comments for now, for this part of slides presentation, we are happy to take it and to use this small pause. You can even raise your hand and ask. Если вы хотите задать вопрос кому-то из... Dear, I will talk a little bit in Russian because we don't have interpretation. Сейчас у нас пауза на тот момент, пока мы не вернем перевод. К сожалению, бывают технические сложности и трудности. Поэтому у нас есть вопросы. Сейчас мы берем паузу для вопросов. Мы до этого обсуждали о том, что Украина сейчас не может рассчитывать на заявленное количество воды, которое было, к минимуму, потому что сейчас многое уничтожено или на оккупированных территориях. Мы и как раз Вибhushri согласилась, что да, это будет учтено, и она рада получать информацию, дискутировать об этом далее и работать над этим. У нас есть еще один вопрос, который сейчас зачитаем на английском, Вибhushri ответит на английском, и я или Ольга поможет его перевести. The other question, maybe you see in the chat,
Yes.
Can you comment the roll the call? And yes.
Sure. So maybe, I'd be happy to take that question already. There is definitely a trend we've seen or we've observed in some countries with coal-fired power plants sort of either getting restarted or money going into starting them. And actually, that's one of the concerns with the competition with conventional sources, because this is where it's not that well. First, these are coal is very much a dirty fuel, and then the second part becomes the cost and the time involved in setting up these kind of power plants. So in the end, with money being channeled into other conventional sources, there is money going away from renewable energy.
Great, thank you. We do have our Russian interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And I will want to remind you that you have like more or less 5 minutes to,
Yes.
if you, yeah, good.
Mm-hmm. Sounds great. So going back to the policy part, so we talked about the good news, the not so good news, and now I think it's really important to look back, to look ahead, and the role of policies in this regard. So when we did an analysis of this, you'll see that there are renewable energy targets across the power, transport, heating, and cooling sectors. So the 76% or the 41%, 35% refer to the number of, or the percentage of countries having targets, renewable energy targets in power, for example, out of the 18 focus countries. So 76% out of 18 countries had targets in renewable energy in the power sector. 41% had it in transport and 35% in heating and cooling. Now, what is really important to understand that when we set targets, those reflect the ambition. And this is where the circularity of going from ambitions to markets, so ambition, policy, implementation, investments, and markets is really important. So there is ambition. However, when we look at the targets and which countries achieved it, you'll see that 23% of the 76%, so that's a really tiny number of countries in the power sector, achieved their renewable energy target, renewable electricity target. Whereas for transport, none of the countries having a target achieved them. And for heating and cooling, of the 35%, only 2/3 of the countries could achieve their targets. So it's really important for these policies and the implementation, then followed by investment in markets, they really need to be strengthened. So far, the ambition is there, but policies and implementation still need, the ambition needs to be supported. Policies also need to be broadened. So with CBAM and export markets, and we see the attention or the driving force with CBAM, there is an impact on trade and goods supply. So there's an economic impact, which means that trade policies need to be strengthened. There's a role of energy in trade, the water, food, energy nexus, given that there are many occurrences of this nexus across Central Asia, Western Balkans, Caucasus. And of course, industrial and economic policy to support local value creation and jobs. So where do we go from here? How can we build value for renewables? Because what I'm also aware that all of us sitting around the table have an interest in some way or form to increase renewables uptake. And I think here it's really important to highlight that renewables is a solution beyond energy supply. It creates resilience and a new energy governance with regards to that. So there's resiliency of renewables to shocks and conflict. And you'd already mentioned this. There was a participant in the chat who mentioned it, and there's been a huge part of solar and wind capacities which have come under regions of active fire or have been destroyed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nonetheless, when it comes to a solar PV plant and conflict, if there is damage to a solar PV plant, it's usually to a panel or a bunch of panels, and this is what the Ukrainian Renewable Energy Association told us for some of the plants, was that it's there are parts of the plants which have been damaged, which means that on the other side, unlike fossil fuel sources, it would be a matter of replacing these parts rather than renewables being used as weapons of mass destruction. There's also resilience when it comes to climate. We've already seen many examples across the world of how renewables play into climate resiliency. Diversification, because it helps to reduce imports and fluctuating prices. And of course, decentralization, because renewable helps to serve remote areas, addresses energy poverty, therefore playing a big role in socioeconomic and political priorities. And to achieve all of this, and this is my last slide, we need urgent and concrete action by governments in collaboration with the private sector and civil society. There is the need to invest in energy supply, but also energy infrastructure. It's very important to think about grids and upgrading infrastructure when it comes to increasing renewables or, well, addressing future demand. We have to go beyond electricity and looking into heating, cooling, and transport, given the high levels of consumption by these sectors. There's a need to build stronger supply chains, domestic and regional. And here there's to address the limited industrial capacities for manufacturing, assembling, but imports finally reduce economic value. So over here, I really want to highlight the role of regional cooperation. And finally, I think continuously closing data gaps. And this means that for reports such as ours, we can, or not just reports such as ours, but data in general is a powerful tool. And I think it's very important for countries, for civil society, for private sector, for anybody involved in the renewable energy transition to really look at how to strengthen data, because finally, if we have good data, we can make good progress. So with that, and with the attention needed by action and attention needed by governments, I want to end my presentation. I will send you the link to the report and hope that you will email us with any queries or also continue to interact with us. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Vibhushri, for this great work and your input. And now we have the room for 1 or 2 questions or comments to raise. So you can use the possibility to put something in the chat or either raise your hand and speak out loud. Okay, great. Tatiana, and if you can say a few words, just like remind us which sector or which climate and energy topics are you working on, from what organization, what city, it would be great. Tatiana.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Tatiana from Kiev, from Vasilkis & Partners law firm, and I work in investment in natural gas and renewables. And my question is about, you mentioned the government's needs to emphasize investment. So my question is, what do you feel? Is it like state-supported investment or private investment more? Because we'll need 2 different like instruments to do that. And if you feel there is a correlation, so what we need more, and maybe what is more possible for us currently to attract private investment or to work on government investment? Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Tatiana. So, I mean, I'm also drawing on some of the examples I've seen on the global level, because I think that the region is finally a microcosm of how many other regions work. So I think when it comes to increasing support or action by governments, it's also about creating the necessary infrastructure. And by a necessary infrastructure, there is the need for policy support, to really show that you're going from ambition to implementation. That is where the governments really come in, but also creating better, risk profiles or improving the risk or uncertainty for investors. to be able to invest in these countries. So I think it's a bit of both. There is, of course, state support, but I'm aware that not all countries sometimes have access to those funds. But in order to attract private investment, international investment, it's really important to be able to attract them by way of stronger targets and stronger policy really and implementation support, but also looking into other aspects such as, trade and other policies which are connected, and also looking at, technology supply chains and that entire support system for renewables, and creating a sort of bankability or increasing the bankability of projects by supporting project developers. I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Like the bankability comment was something I wanted to hear. Thank you so much. Because we have this problem. We used to have it in renewables for a very long time, and we have it still.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we
You're
also
welcome.
have a question. Yeah, thank you from Mamuka. Please, we can turn on your mic.
My name is Mamuka Bilova. I'm from Georgia. I'm working closely with the Greens Movement of Georgia, the national NGO. I have this question: how renewable the hydro is, taking into account its major environmental impacts? So in our region, in Caucasus in particular, there were strong reservations against the hydropower because of this the environmental impacts and social impacts. And so if you ask people, they say it's renewable. I personally believe it's not renewable. What is your opinion?
Sure, thanks, Mamuka, for raising indeed a very tricky question. And I think there is, so as REN21, we consider hydropower as a renewable technology. There is, so I think on the renewability of, or the renewable nature of hydro, there is, for us, that's the stand. What you're also referring to, I can see that is also the sustainability of hydropower as an energy source. And on that, there is a lot of research which is being conducted and including something that we will be publishing in about 8-10 months or so on the sustainability of renewables in general, since all of these technologies are fairly new, have gained traction, and very little has been assessed about supply chain, the environmental, social impacts, etc. However, I think if we put it in relation to other fossil fuel sources at the moment and where this entire equation plays in, there is more argument, or from my perspective, very personal perspective, there's more argument for hydropower than against it when we consider alternative conventional energy sources such as fossil fuels. And I think this is also where it's important to keep that in mind, but also where the role of solar and wind and other renewable sources is really important, because of course hydro capacity, especially I recall from Georgia, has been built many years ago, and some of it needs to be refreshed. But also solar and wind are important to balance capacity, to diversify the energy mix, and to reduce the overall impact on just one energy source. So it's a bit of, let's say there's no clear straight answer to this, except to say that hydro is a renewable source. But then when we look at the sustainability of all renewables, that's something us as people working in the renewable energy sector do need to do, but also keep in mind hydro, other renewable sources with conventional and fossil fuel sources. So some balancing needed there, but it's always a bit tricky. Yeah, thank you.
And I also have one question for you. Like coming back to the topic of our webinars today, I know that have some time passed from the release of the study. So maybe for today, with the way the war in Ukraine is going, can you say how the war is currently affecting the sector directly or indirectly? Is it impact noticeable? Because in your presentations, like one of the factors that can impact, and for now, can you see some trends or impact? What can you highlight on this?
So I think that's a very good question, because indeed, on one hand, the impact is quite immediate, and that's on the capacity which has been either destroyed or coming under the regions of active fire, or under the regions affected by the invasion. So there is an impact which, with Ukraine being one of the leaders in the entire region on renewable energy, is going to have a slowdown in terms of its renewable energy capacity and uptake. I think there's another very important impact to mention, which is the investment profile of many of the countries in the region, but especially Ukraine and neighboring countries, because at some point there will be a bit of tension in terms of how the international, or we talked about the investors or the investment with Tatiana. So I think that framework or that environment will face a sure impact for in the medium term. But I think in the longer term, it's really important for us to look at the impact on energy security and sovereignty, because finally, I mean, and this is more a personal observation, but many conflicts around the world start with a destabilization of the energy supply in countries. And with that happening, it's really important for us to also consider that in the end, this is probably, whether it's a, I mean, I don't want to call it a wake-up call, but I think it's definitely a moment to think about energy security, sovereignty, and what energy supply plays an important role. And so for all of us, we can safely say there's definitely a role for renewables there. So when we look forward, I think that's definitely a big lesson to take out of this.
Yeah, thank you. And Andrei, you have a question. I will ask you to keep it short. The question as well is the answer, if possible, so we can keep going. Yeah. Andrei.
One point of your presentation, you mentioned that four of 13 countries are like 70% to 70% dependent on energy imports. But you didn't mention on which imports. So do you mean Russian imports, or energy imports from Russia? And if yes, then what conclusion should it lead for these countries, for those countries, probably to reshape the supply chains? And if yes, then how should this supply chain looks like in the future? So what does it mean for them and for us?
So maybe the first part of your question on the four countries, which are Armenia, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, importing more than 70% of their primary energy supply. So, I mean, as you already noticed, there are 5 countries which are exporters, and then the remaining are importers. And of the importers, these 4 import a very large percent of their energy supply. And from what we have seen, that most of the imports actually are fossil fuel imports. So the oil, gas plays a very big role in when it comes to the imports of energy, and a lot of this is imported from the 5 countries that we saw, which are energy exporters, and Russia being a top exporter of oil and gas to these to all of the countries, but particularly the 4 that were highlighted. So that's one. That's probably one thing to keep in mind. And then when it comes to the way forward, I think this is, and maybe this is actually one of the key messages also from the study that we did, but really the question of energy security and looking at creating infrastructure around that. So better supply chains, because I know with the technology supply chains currently in place for renewables, it makes there's also an impact on costs of solar PV and wind, for example. So really strengthening the supply chains on a regional level, looking at strengthening policy and implementation, but also looking into decentralized and diversified energy sources is probably a way forward. So we call it a bit of a new energy governance, which is that it needs to not be centralized as a fossil fuel system, but there has to be multiple actors and multiple players involved in the governance of renewable energy. And that's really something that I would say that all of these countries, particularly the ones that are currently facing, will have future demand, will have future growth, need to think of.
Thank you, Vibhushri, for your input and for your answerings. And it's a great question to go to the next speaker about this decentralized and centralized and their overall mutual impacts. I want to give a word to Alitsa Kizakova, senior researcher in the Center for the Study of Global Regions. She will speak about European Union, Central Asia relations in the energy sector. So I want to give you words. I will stop sharing my screen. Yeah. And
thank you so much.
Alisa.
Hi, greetings from Prague, Czech Republic. Really grateful to be part of this discussion and large network. I want to thank everyone who actually contributed to making this happen. Really impressive list of participants. And saying that, I really would like to have a dialogue as this is outlined. So I'll be sharing some findings that I've sort of collected for my policy paper on EU Central Asia collaboration in energy, and also that I keep updating. And so if you have inputs even from the other parts of this broader region, that could relate to this topic, policy advice or comments in relation to my recommendations, I really would like to hear this after my remarks, because that's continuous exchange and I don't position myself as a person who knows it all. Building on obviously my previous speakers, Vibhushri's remarks, she gave this nice broader context. I have a very specific task from the organizers to focus on EU and Central Asia, namely obviously Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and the engagements there. Like I said, this EU collaboration relates to other partners that are represented here today. And I was given some set of questions that I'm going to explore because I want to stick to what the organizers are interested in, but I also will add some additional comments. One of the key questions was, what is the cornerstone of this EU engagement in Central Asia in energy sector? And I've done some work on the EU strategy on Central Asia. We had the second one come to light in 2019, and a lot of reflection took place, not just from the governmental side of EU institutions, but also think tanks. And luckily, we were able to engage partners from Central Asia in Europe, coming to Europe and share their observations, which I find extremely valuable, because sometimes we have these bold goals, but we don't recognize all the geopolitical and the local nuances that we need to consider. And that's always my aim, to look at to what extent EU can actually be a strong partner and come to some sort of a common conclusions there. When I was looking at it, obviously, and some of you already mentioned, but we have a war taking place and infrastructure has been affected. Obviously, transports have been affected. Tensions and discussions between even EU member states have taken place. And this is ongoing. So it's hard sometimes to deliver concrete reflections on the status quo, but I think some trends are noticeable. Obviously, another element that we have to consider, that even Central Asia has, as was already pointed out, reliance on oil, gas, and coal as compared to really moving forward with the not just having pro-climate rhetoric, but also reaching some renewable energy targets. So EU can sort of help to be a bridge, and maybe specific European countries with good experience and very proactive approach, regardless of the instabilities taking place right now. However, I still believe EU lacks a strong diplomatic voice in the region, and it's been very focused on near neighborhood. Obviously, right now we have Ukraine taking place, but also there have been discussions about the Balkan states, which we have to consider, who are trying to access the EU memberships. So that's been preoccupying, but also EU funding has been distributed to greater Central Asia, not just obviously the mentioned countries, but also Afghanistan has been another factor there. So the sharing of funding is something that they have agreed upon, but it shouldn't then overtake the efforts in Central Asia with those countries. Another one is that we have to consider all these other players that are involved, obviously Russia, China, but also United States, Iran, Turkey, even interests of Japan, India, and perhaps imports from or engagements from Japan and others. So this is also something I'm looking at, and it's obviously very broad observation. But if we look at the actual cornerstone and framework, as I said, we do have the strategy from EU, which clearly outlines the efforts to help the region to transition to the low carbon economy, but also make sure the energy is efficient and there is sufficient engagements in renewable projects and facilitate electricity connections. Another point that the EU made was recently in its documents by identifying Central Asia as a key region with resource potential for solar, wind, and hydroelectric energy, and also sort of tapping into the raw materials with these countries, and especially they highlighted Kazakhstan as the big player. Another, I would say, step was the EU efforts to engage energy partners with its efforts to reduce dependence on Russia, and I think this has been exacerbated with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So I would say the EU Power, or sorry, Repower EU plan, which has been put in place, really wants to tap into the energy sector, but also work on energy security. And I think these three primary documents and declarations show us a path that the EU wants to sort of proceed. When I was also looking at the European Green Deal and how that can, because that was one of the questions, how that can really contribute to working together, I actually saw some very practical spaces where they can work, because the EU Green Deal works with fresh air, clean water, healthy soil, and I think renovate, they want to renovate the energy efficient buildings, but also work on public transport, which requires proper connectivity and linkages there, infrastructure, but also make sure there is a training for a newer generation of skill sets that they can acquire. I personally also embrace work with more representation and participation of women in the energy sector, and also making sure that some projects are not, and this is something we gathered from discussions recently with Just Climate Group, that there shouldn't be focused just sort of gender or sex specific for women having, let's say, access to water in projects and for men having access to infrastructure, that these projects should be made for all, that everybody should be considered as an active participant, And I've noticed somebody's here from Germany who works with society engagement, and I would like to hear from you maybe how your group is actively involved in this particular engagement of society in your efforts. So moving on with this topic, I would say it was already mentioned, there are EU's efforts to transition, but EU is still quite also engaged and has interest in energy resources such as gas and oil. Obviously, with gas, EU hasn't achieved its goal as much as it did with oil. And I was looking at statistics. Kazakhstan is valuable in its exports, and we can see that mostly their products go to European partners, and then followed by Asia and North America, with the percentage Europe was about 53%, Asia 43%, saying that if Kazakhstan is in any way impacted with its engagements with Russia, with interruptions of transports, this affects also European partners. So it is something where EU has to tread very carefully, make sure that there's not too much pressure or involvement to actually harm also Kazakhstan, but also these linkages. So it's a very sensitive field when it comes to engagements. When I was looking at some of the options to diverse or find alternative ways, obviously there are some, but the full potentials have not been tapped into. I don't want to go into too much detail with this one, but I can definitely share that information of finding alternative transcontinental corridors. I would say they tap into the policies. I'm also interested in policies of specific states, such as Kazakhstan and its new Kazakhstan project, which obviously want to diversify and prioritize certain energy transportation, but some of the outcomes have been fairly slow. In terms of gas, in that case, you would also have to involve partners such as Iran, which are under sanctions regime. However, some European countries visited expos in Iran, and there have been some conversations that they could step in case there would be agreements also with the local countries, renewed agreements to provide certain corridors. I would suggest that EU is already helping with some projects and funding that they have at disposal. I can share interactive maps where they help fund gas pipelines, electric lines, and storages and stations that are based in Southeast Asia, Southeast Europe and Middle East. But I would say these are not fully connected to Central Asia, and they would have to find a way how to make this happen. But also they can help with streamlining environmental assessment processes and make this whole process more transparent to investors, because this is really concern of the investors in any sort of energy projects right now, whether it's stable, whether there are any sort of weak hotspots, and also if there is this environmental assessment in place that would work also with the agreed standards and goals. In terms of the renewable energy sources, when I was looking at all countries in Central Asia, I noticed that in the energy mixes, it's quite negligible. Obviously, we mentioned hydropower here today with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And some of these estimations for wind and solar potential are still underutilized. And I would say EU has put in place some workshops, as was one in May, on environment, on water, environment, and climate change cooperation, which took place in the region, involved the local experts and financial institutions. And I think this is really important to go there rather than expect somebody to come to Europe and not just make the pledges, but also find ways that are locally functionable and also help, one of the big points that I highlight is to help the business environment to make it effective, efficient, but also create some job opportunities, because with the traditional approaches, we know lots of people are connected to the coal mining, and towns have been created around this sector. They need to find alternatives that requires more training and more opportunities and skill training. So when I was looking at the data compilation around the solar energy potential in the countries, obviously with the size of the territory, the theoretical solar power potential mainly was in Kazakhstan, 85%, and then Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, they have more intense solar irradiation. So these countries will still be competing. Something we shouldn't be looking at least from the European perspective, and I understand some Central European countries also appreciate if we don't look at it as an integrated region, but rather as individual states and that are working competitively, accessing different partners. It's a multi-vectoral foreign policy where the investments are coming from different sides. So I would say this is quite important to mention. So they are open to working not just with European countries, but also with players such as China, which has been quite prominent in helping with some installations of solar capacity. So this is important to note. However, these wind and solar farms are quite smaller, and they're not fully connected to the national grids. And there is also no real, I would say, capacity for how to store the possible solar power excesses. So this is something that would be helpful. And I think the key takeaway from this is that Europe has to understand that there are collaborations inevitable in this region with other players, because the countries will not stick to one solo or specific donor as we wish. And I think this is critical if we have some goals that we work together with whoever is relevant as well, and find ways. With the documents that I mentioned, they do highlight the access to critical raw material supply chain in the region. And what's important that I won't mention all of these minerals that are accessible, and some need more discoveries, and we need investments in extraction and discovering the potentials. I would argue that 4 key technologies are set to play a key role, and that we would need specific materials for their production: electric vehicles, grid scale batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines. And here I list in my paper, let's say Kazakhstan is the one that would have big potential, larger reserves of chromium, which is used in wind turbines. And then Uzbekistan, let's say copper and silver, which is used in solar energy. So everybody has their niche. Then also there is a potential of lithium, which needs more exploration, and other aspects. One of the key, obviously, questions is there are some challenges. One of the challenges is there is no real phasing out, obviously, of the fossil fuels. And data actually show that there are even increases. Some of the people involved, maybe they are part of this participant group, have stakes in this field. It provides income, revenues. And so if you have governmental officials in place, and I was looking at some of the reforms taking place prior to COVID, also COVID, we had a pandemic. They were ambitious goals, but again, you would have to work with like-minded people who would also collaborate with the government in place. So we have more reformist government, then obviously we can implement these changes and reduce dependence. I'm aware of the time, but
Yes, I think we have like almost out of the time. Maybe one
I'm
or 2
aware
minutes
of the
left.
time.
Maybe we can go to the question block, or please maybe you can finish your main
Let me
point.
please wrap up.
Great, sure.
Yeah. Let me please wrap up my thoughts. So I noticed that some of the challenges are that the legislation hasn't been fully implemented. There have been some changes, and this requires collaboration and work or making changes to legislation. So we cannot simplify the engagements without working with the governments. Also, I noticed there have been streamlining of ministries, like in Kazakhstan, sort of attaching 3 ministries to a Ministry of Energy, making sure there is better coordination. So this is one of the points that's been quite, and then political instability we've seen just recently in Kyrgyzstan. Minister of Energy has been let go. So we need to keep an eye on these domestic developments. Another one is there have been issues like with the energy sector, with electricity shortages, that we have some infrastructure, we put work into it, but we've seen wave of interesting trend of groups of crypto miners coming to country that obviously require more access to electricity, and the government would shut down and be resourceful. So that's one of the considerations. If I move on to some quick conclusions, from my view, there is interest from Europe to get more engaged, but Europe will be more distracted with what's going on. Saying that, there is this clear plan right now to engage Central Asian countries with pooling resources and pretty much make joint purchases, and also on the other hand supporting Ukraine, let's say, and other impacted by war, by making sure there is rebuilding of the energy sector. So hand in hand, there is a synchronized work. And I think EU is good at making sure this is taking place simultaneously with, making sure that they include platforms from Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and the Western Balkans at the same time. And I think that's a big plus. And also, I noticed another big plus is helping with training in projects. EU documentation can be quite wordy and difficult to comprehend for the projects, and they can really train people and help them how to manage and submit applications and coordinate it. Another one was working with communities, smaller communities, energy communities, and work with vulnerable groups. And that's something that other competitors might not be good at because that's not their priority. And I think Europe can really focus on these specific groups and provide some subsidies with the government's support. As I mentioned, the breaking stereotypes already, who benefits from these projects. So I want to explore that part, but also be complementary in projects and funding with other programs. I look at the CAREC program and Asia Development Bank programs. United States has investment funds, and they collaborate, making sure that there is no duplicity in funding, and also help with and focus also on what's happening on the ground with intra-regional platforms. We can avoid, obviously, the collaboration with Russia there, or between Central Asian countries themselves. So keep an eye, monitor these collaborations. So if I can move into the question part, I would really appreciate if you have any suggestions, recommendations from your expertise, what else could be considered, or whether you observe, if you're based in Europe, any activities that could be implemented, even at this time, when it's all just because the EU strategy on Central Asia has been renewed only 3 years ago, less than 3 years ago, when you consider submission. So we don't, and then we had pandemics. So some of these goals have been restated only quite recently. So I would say, even though we have clarity and the framework is in place, what do you see as workable in your environments? And maybe it's missing in a conversation.
Great. Great, thank you for your input. I have a lot of thoughts that we also can reflect. Maybe I can repeat your questions for the audience. If you do have any suggestions extra what wasn't highlighted by Alisa, maybe you also can say, is it relevant or not really relevant for your country? Or if you're not in the central, you're not based in Central Asia, but you have some interesting reflections or point from your experience, like with EU, Central Asia, or EU EECCA cooperation, I say. So you can share it now. Olga?
Можна?
Yep.
Ольга. Я пару фраз скажу просто про то,
I
что
would like to tell a couple of thoughts when we discuss a topic, cooperation of European Union and Central Asia. It is a development of relations, of a high hierarchy and big distance. EU, it is a remote West developed, and Central Asia is unknown region which is not included in Asia and not in Europe to be studied or in the network if there is a network. And very often Central Asia like a white spot. And now it seems to me that we see a leveling, equalizing of hierarchy, and Central Asia has also expertise, especially when we talk about climate change, about the local solutions. People living there, they know answers on questions, and the people who are in Berlin, and they will look for solutions, spending thousands of euro and working many years, and coming back to expertise and experience of people and equalizing of levels and focusing on different countries, because regions, it is good, it is convenient to see on commonalities of the countries, but also there are differences. And when people who have resources to conduct studies, research, or to invest the money in renewable sources of energy. And when they understand, recognize that there is not only Central Asia, but there are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and each of the countries has own difficulties, complexes, people, problems, and started to have in-depth research and to understand that additional resources necessary for interpretation, translation, trips to be familiar more, because geographically there are distances. But I see these trends, and not only in the public sector, but in the sector of experts, and this is like a positive trend. And it is interesting for me to know, do other people notice, are there any other risk? And if you listen in Russian channel and you are from Central Asia, please write in chat or raise your hands.
If I may, so I understand the comment that it was sort of suggested that there is not enough diversified approach to specific countries and knowledge, right? And the studies don't take that in account. Because just a quick comment, when I'm looking at some of the latest works done, let's say on solar and comparisons, obviously the data that is collected is not always complete, because some countries underreport, such as Turkmenistan, let's say in my case, and others, obviously, like you said, they have different strengths and weaknesses. But in a way, I would say those who are involved in these studies, actually, some of them come from Central Asia as well. So there is, I mean, I've been looking at some Norwegian research done. And I also looked at how there are sources, let's say, from the Chinese authors and others, Russian, how they interpret not just, let's say, the European authors and data sets. So I agree that there is a limitation. The beauty, I would say, of the collaboration with EU is that it's now realized it has to have a twin approach. So it works with the region as a whole on key priority areas, but also bilateral approach specifically targeted to each country, what they need. And I, you know, these are fact sheets that are published, but I agree that it's very unique and necessary to understand all these nuances and also use the local languages and experts to really get a better picture. So I hope I understood the remark correctly, but I agree that lots of work has to be done, and we need to tap more into the local expertise.
Ola, is it okay? Are you okay with the answer? Good. So we have a little bit lack of time, so I just want also to rely on expertise in the room, as Alica said, and I will ask you to answer one question with the Mentimeter instrument. You can be familiar with it or not. I will share it in a chat, or even you can use QR codes that I will show you now. One moment. Not this question, but this question. So this question, yeah. And the question would be, what can positively affect the sustainability of the energy system in your country, especially the short periods coming, maybe this winter, next year, because of all these vulnerable, all these processes, geopolitical processes going on in the world and in the region as well. So please go with a link in a chat or use QR code if you want to use your smartphone on this. And I would be happy if you say a few words in any language that would be comfortable, but better it would be English or Russian, so that I can read it at least. And please specify, is this anonymous feedback from you? But if you can specify your country in the answer, it would be great. So we're asking for experts from Central Asia, from Georgia, from Ukraine, from Armenia, especially what could support, what could positively affect the sustainability of your energy system this winter and next year. We would be happy to see the answers. Maybe I will ask the Germany, Paris, and people that don't like settling in the EECCA region, not answering, because we are really interested in how it goes in Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia. And I need to switch to the Menti. So good. I see the first answers. But please, maybe if you can specify the country that you're answering by, it would be great. And also, I see if you have some problems, you can also use a chat and put your answers in the chat. As Mikola done, he said that several biogas projects are being launched in Ukraine, and it could be really relevant for Ukraine now. We also have answers as more small-scale renewables, less dependency on Russian fossil fuels, and dependency on fuels, yes. Save energy, use biogas plants, solar batteries. Good. If you want to put more answers, you can relaunch the link. You can also do it one more. Time, promoting strongly net metering for PV installations by individuals and communities. Good, strongly net metering, digitalization of energy supply and integration into European grid for Ukraine. Few more. We have almost 50 people here. Hopefully you're listening to us. and can answer here or in the chat this question. You can also answer in Russian. It would be okay, and we can really interpret, translate it. In Georgia, improvement of energy efficiency in the buildings and industry. I will repeat it in Russian. Если вы хотите ответить о том, что может сейчас позитивно повлиять на устойчивость энергетической системы вашей страны?
And Helen is asking this question in Russian. That the people can answer this question either in chat or here.
Good. So we see energy efficiency, decentralization, promoting net metering for the renewables, biogas plants. We can also see the similar decisions that we can do. So yeah, hope that we have much more time for the discussion. And I want to thank Alitza for your input, sorry. I really sure that we will go on with the question of energy system and winter with the next webinars. And I also want to pass the word to Olga to announce it, how we can keep talking about questions that we raised today. Ola? I think it's interpretation a little bit slower.
Да? Окей. Я в переводе не услышала, что мне передали слово. Извиняюсь за молчание. Спасибо большое.
I apologize for silence. I didn't hear that the floor was given to us. Thank you very much for your stay with us during 1.5 hours. Thank you that you were engaged in discussion and speakers who come. It is interesting to get feedback immediately to know exactly did they reach the target with their topic and to be the participant of discussion, because it is not a lecture purely. And I invite you to our next webinar, and probably you're registered. We would like to remind it will be the same day, the same time after 1 week. And gradually we will switch to the following, what world we would like to build up. Today we discussed from different angles. What is the problem? We are talking about the climate policy, that we have to reduce emissions, to transit to renewables, and now there is a big war, and how this war had impact on our road we built, but we continue construction, our building, and now even more seriously we talk than in the past how very important to switch to renewables and how it's important to look for the ways to keep heat and to be heated not only by coal and other fossil fuel, but with other renewables. We will talk next week with experts from our region, and we will wait for your expertise. You will keep with you and share with us, because it is impossible to make all participants as speakers, but we give you opportunity to share with what you know or share important materials, and we are looking forward to see you again at this meeting.
For joining. Thank you, Alitza and Vibhushri, for their great inputs. A lot of thoughts that we can take with us until the next webinar, at least. And before we say bye, I will ask you maybe if you want to, and if you can, to switch on your video and audio and say bye and thank you in your language. It would be great to see your faces at least for once till this webinar. And thank you for the commenters who also actively joined today. Дякую всім за зустріч і до побачення.
Всім щасливо всього.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to mention, I noticed there were questions in the chat for me. I'll just probably reply to the specific people. I haven't noticed them before.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all.
Спасибо вам большое. Все было очень хорошо.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Everything was okay.
On hitting winter challenges and how we can go beyond the fossil fuel. Thank you.